Rachel Donovan stood under the flickering lights of the school library, her knuckles white as she gripped a heavy brass bookend slick with her husband's blood. Across from her, the man she had loved for a decade. The man the world knew as a devoted father. Wiped a crimson smear from his jaw and smiled a cold, predatory smile. Outside, the muffled cheers of the autumn benefit continued, oblivious to the fact that the PTA president was currently standing over a briefcase containing her own forged confession and a one-way ticket to a life on the run. The heavy oak doors burst open as flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the scene. Rachel, disheveled and armed, standing over a victim who looked perfectly terrified. As the police shouted for her to drop the weapon, she realized the briefcase didn't contain the money that could save her. It contained the final nail in her coffin. Mark leaned in, his voice a ghost of a whisper against the sirens. "They don't want the truth, Rachel," he hissed. "They want a villain, and I gave them the perfect one." The fluorescent lights in the PTA office emitted a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate against the inside of Rachel Donovan's skull. It was a sterile, lonely sound, echoing the hollow feeling in her chest as she sat before the laminate desk. Her fingers, usually so steady and precise, hovered above the keyboard. The plastic keys felt cool, slightly sticky with the residue of 1,000 frantic lunch-hour emails. She exhaled, the sound sharp in the cramped room, and adjusted the screen's brightness to combat the glare. The Gala database sprawled across the monitor, a labyrinth of numbers, donor names, and vendor invoices waiting to be cross-checked. This was her domain, her sanctuary of order. She clicked through the first few entries, the usual mix of suburban generosity and bureaucratic clutter, telling herself this was routine. Her pen tapped a staccato rhythm against the desk, leaving tiny, permanent indentations in the wood. She needed the numbers to align. She needed the world to make sense. As she scrolled deeper into the subfolders of the school's administrative drive, a red banner flashed in the lower corner of the screen. It was a background check notification, generated automatically by a new security patch Sarah had installed the week before. Rachel's breath hitched. She hadn't even known the system could run these checks against the spouse volunteer registry. The cursor trembled as she moved it toward the file, the rough fabric of the mousepad scraping against her palm. The document loaded with an agonizing, pixelated crawl. Each line of text stripping away a layer of the life she had spent a decade building. At the top of the page, the name Marcus Vane appeared in bold, black letters. Beneath it, in the alias field, was the name she said every night before bed: Mark Donovan. The screen blurred. Criminal record, fraud, grand larceny. Before sharpening into a terrifying clarity, she read the words 3 times, waiting for them to rearrange themselves into a mistake. But they remained fixed, cold and indicting. The air in the office thickened, pressing against her skin until her lungs felt small and brittle. The knot in her stomach tightened as she opened a secondary link attached to the background report. It was a scanned mugshot from a decade ago. The man in the photo had the same whiskey-colored eyes and the same slight tilt to his jaw. But the expression was different. Harder, predatory. This was Marcus Vane, a man who had spent 4 years in a federal penitentiary for financial crimes she couldn't even pronounce. She looked at her wedding ring, the diamond catching the sickly yellow light of the office, and felt a surge of nausea. Her husband was a stranger. Every memory of their life together, the birth of their children, the purchase of their home, the quiet mornings over coffee, now felt like a scene from a movie she had watched but never actually lived. Somewhere down the hall, a copier whirred to life, its mechanical groan sounding like a distant warning. She was alone in a building full of ghosts, staring at the evidence of a life built on a foundation of ash. Driven by a sudden, frantic instinct, Rachel opened her private banking app in a side window. She began to cross-reference their mortgage documents with the PTA endowment fund records she had been auditing. Her fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion fueled by adrenaline and terror. The account numbers for their recent home equity loan didn't match the bank's standard formatting. She pulled up the PTA's outgoing wire transfers and felt the floor drop out from under her. A transfer of $50,000, earmarked for the school's new library wing, had been routed through a shell company called MV Holdings. The account number for MV Holdings was identical to the one Mark used to pay their country club dues. They weren't just living on his salary. They were living on the stolen futures of the children she saw every morning in the pickup line. The paper trail was a noose, and Mark had spent years tightening it around her neck without her ever feeling the cord. The realization of the scale of the theft was a physical blow. Rachel tracked the diversions back through 3 years of records, her eyes stinging from the blue light of the monitor. It was a sophisticated embezzlement scheme, hidden behind layers of fake vendor invoices and clerical errors that she had personally smoothed over, thinking she was being helpful. Marcus Vane hadn't just married her. He had recruited her as an unwitting accomplice. Every time she had bragged about the PTA's record-breaking fundraising, she had been announcing the size of his next haul. The resources of the charity, meant for books and playground equipment, had been systematically drained to fund their sleek SUV and the designer blazers she wore like armor. She felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat. She was the queen of the PTA, the pillar of the community, and she was married to a parasite who was eating the community from the inside out. The office door creaked open, and Rachel nearly leaped out of her skin. Sarah Whitmore stood in the doorway, her dark brown hair escaping its messy bun in frantic wisps. She looked like she had been living on caffeine and spite for a week straight. Sarah didn't say anything at first. She just looked at Rachel's pale face and then at the screen, her pale gray eyes narrowing with a hunter's precision. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Donovan," Sarah said, her voice a sharp burst that cut through the hum of the room. Rachel tried to minimize the window, her hand fumbling with the mouse, but Sarah was already moving. She stormed into the room, her combat boots thudding on the linoleum. "Don't bother," Sarah snapped, leaning over the desk. "I saw the flag on the server. I knew someone was digging where they shouldn't. I just didn't think it would be the Golden Girl." "Sarah, I can explain," Rachel whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know." Sarah didn't look convinced, but the urgency in Rachel's eyes seemed to give her pause. The IT specialist's fingers began to twitch, a telltale sign that she was itching to get to a keyboard. "The treasurer is due in 20 minutes for the pre-gala briefing," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "If she sees this, we're both done. She'll call the cops before you can say audit." Without waiting for permission, Sarah pulled a stool up to the desk and began typing with a speed that made Rachel dizzy. They worked in a frantic, silent partnership, Sarah's sharp commands guiding Rachel through the process of encrypting the scraped data. They had to lock the files to create a digital fortress around the evidence before it could be wiped by whoever was monitoring the system from the outside. The atmosphere in the small office became a pressure cooker. Every footstep in the hallway made Rachel flinch, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Almost there," Sarah muttered, her eyes reflected in the blue glow of the dual monitors. "I'm rerouting the access logs. If anyone tries to delete this now, it'll trigger a hard copy backup in the basement server." Just as the progress bar hit 90%, A violent crash shattered the silence. The glass pane of the office door exploded inward, raining crystalline shards across the floor. A figure loomed in the doorway, a massive wall of muscle clad in a black ski mask and a heavy work jacket. He didn't speak. He just lunged toward the desk with a heavy, purposeful stride. Rachel scrambled back, her chair screeching against the floor, as the intruder reached for the laptop. Fear turned into a cold, sharp clarity. Rachel didn't think. She acted. As the intruder's gloved hand closed around the edge of the MacBook, she lunged forward, her fingers locking onto the other side. "No!" she shrieked, the sound raw and primal. The man was easily twice her size, his breath coming in heavy, angry grunts through the fabric of the mask. He jerked the laptop toward him, nearly pulling Rachel across the desk. She kicked out, her sensible heel catching him in the shin, but he didn't even flinch. He swung a heavy arm, backhanding her across the face. The world spun for a second, the taste of copper filling her mouth. But she didn't let go. She couldn't let go. If he took the computer, he took her only chance at survival. She was fighting for her children, for her name, for the truth that was currently being compressed into a series of encrypted bits. Her hand brushed against something cold and heavy on the edge of the shelf. The crystal Volunteer of the Year trophy she had received last spring. Her fingers curled around the jagged, decorative base. With a choked cry of rage, she swung the award with both hands. The crystal caught the intruder squarely on the temple with a sickening thud. He staggered, his grip on the laptop loosening just enough for Rachel to yank it free. He groaned, a low, animal sound, and lunged again. But his balance was gone. Rachel shoved him with every ounce of strength she possessed, her shoulder connecting with his chest. He tumbled backward, crashing through a thin plywood partition that separated the office from the supply closet. The sound of splintering wood and falling boxes filled the room, providing a chaotic symphony for her escape. "Go! Get the drive!" Sarah yelled, already fumbling with a black USB stick she had pulled from her pocket. Rachel dove back to the desk, her hands shaking so violently she could barely line up the port. The computer chimed, a cheerful, mundane sound that felt like a mockery. As the transfer began. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. The intruder was already stirring in the wreckage of the supply closet, his heavy boots kicking aside stacks of construction paper. Rachel grabbed the thumb drive the moment the "safe to remove" notification appeared. She didn't look back at Sarah, who was already ducking under the desk to sever the power lines. Rachel bolted through the shattered door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the sharp edges of the crystal trophy still clutched in her left hand like a primitive dagger. She didn't stop until she reached the darkened sanctuary of her SUV in the school's far parking lot. Her chest heaved, the cold night air stinging her lungs. She fumbled with the laptop, her fingers slick with sweat, and plugged the drive back in. She needed to know what was worth a man breaking through a door for. As the files decrypted, a hidden spreadsheet appeared, titled simply, "Final Phase." It wasn't just a record of past thefts. It was a schedule. The remaining balance of the PTA endowment, nearly $400,000, was flagged for a final transfer to a bank in the Cayman Islands. The timestamp on the instruction was set for midnight tonight. She looked at the clock on her dashboard. 8:45 p.m. She had less than 4 hours before the money, and her husband vanished forever. A sharp rap on the window made her scream, the laptop sliding off her lap. It was Sarah, her face bruised and her hoodie torn. Rachel rolled the window down an inch, her heart still racing. "I followed you," Sarah panted, leaning against the door. "Listen, Rachel. I have to tell you something. I've been tracking those missing funds for months. She paused, her pale eyes searching Rachel's. "I thought it was you. You're the one who signs the checks. You're the one who always has the perfect life. I thought you were just another suburban parasite." Rachel felt a fresh wave of pain at the words, but she nodded slowly. "I don't blame you," she whispered. "I would have suspected me too." Sarah reached through the gap in the window and squeezed Rachel's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "We're going to get him, Rachel. But you need to know, he's not just running. He's leaving you to take the fall for everything." The drive home was a blur of neon lights and mounting dread. Rachel pulled into her driveway, the manicured lawn and the white clapboard siding of her house looking like a stage set that was about to be struck. She hurried through the mudroom, the smell of lavender and expensive floor wax mocking her. In the corner, Mark's gym bag sat slumped against the bench, smelling of cedar and stale sweat. She shouldn't have looked, but the impulse was a physical ache. She unzipped the side pocket, expecting to find nothing but a damp towel. Instead, her fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of heavy stationery. She smoothed it out on the bench, her eyes scanning the bold red header. Final notice of eviction. The bank was seizing the house in 6 hours. Mark hadn't paid the mortgage in 8 months. Every late night at the office had been a lie, a slow-motion collapse of their entire existence. She stood in the center of her designer kitchen, the silence of the house pressing in on her. 6 hours. At 3 a.m., the life she had fought so hard to build would officially belong to the state. She grabbed her keys and bolted for the door, driven by a desperate need to find Mark, to scream the truth into his face until he broke. She drove like a woman possessed, weaving through the light evening traffic toward downtown Manhattan. The glass and steel high-rise that housed Vane and Associates, formerly Donovan Financial, loomed against the skyline like a tombstone. She bypassed the security desk with a practiced smile, her PTA-honed charm acting as a mask. But when she reached the 42nd floor, the elevator doors opened to a ghost town. The glass doors were locked, and through them, she could see the skeletal remains of an office. The desks were bare, the file cabinet stood open and empty, and the expensive abstract art had been stripped from the walls. Mark hadn't just left for the day. He had liquidated his life. The realization that he was truly gone, that he had accelerated his timeline while she was playing at being a detective, sent her reeling back into the hallway. She stumbled toward the elevator, her knees feeling like water. When she reached her SUV in the parking garage, she sat for a moment, her forehead pressed against the steering wheel, counting to 10 just to keep from screaming. She turned the key, wanting nothing more than the comfort of her own bed, however temporary it was. But as she pulled onto the main road, she felt a sickening lurch. She pressed the brake pedal to slow for a red light, and it sank all the way to the floor with a soft, spongy sigh. The car didn't slow. "No, no," she whimpered, pumping the pedal frantically. She had to use the emergency brake, the tires screeching as she fishtailed into a side street, narrowly missing a parked delivery truck. Mark hadn't just lied. He had tried to kill her, or at least keep her off the road long enough to finish his work. By the time she managed to limp the car back to Maplewood using the handbrake and sheer luck, the sun had long since set, leaving the suburbs in a shroud of deceptive peace. She pulled into her driveway, her hands cramped from gripping the wheel. The house was dark, save for a single light in the foyer. As she stepped inside, the silence hit her like a physical weight. "Mark," she called out, her voice thin and trembling. There was no answer, not even the familiar, frantic clicking of their golden retriever's paws on the hardwood. "Cooper." She tried again, her heart sinking. She followed a faint scratching sound toward the basement door. She threw it open and found the dog huddled at the bottom of the stairs, the door having been locked from the outside. Someone had been here. Someone was perhaps still here. The house, her sanctuary, now felt like a hunting ground. She didn't have time to process the fear before a shadow detached itself from the corner of the garage. She had gone back out to grab the kids' soccer cleats, a mundane task her brain clung to for sanity, when a man stepped into the pool of light from the overhead opener. He was dressed in a suit that was a little too shiny, his hair slicked back with a greasy sheen. "Mrs. Donovan," he said, his voice a smooth, oily rasp. Or is it vain? I forget which lie we're using today. Rachel froze, her fingers tightening around the cleats. "Who are you? Get out of my house." The man smiled, a wide, mirthless expression that didn't reach his cold eyes. "I'm a process server, technically, but mostly I'm a debt collector for some very unhappy men in Newark. Men your husband owes a great deal of money to. Money he doesn't seem to have." The man took a step closer, his hand reaching into his coat pocket. "Now, I know Mark is a slippery one, but he wouldn't leave his beautiful wife without a little something for a rainy day, would he? We're going to take a little drive, you and I. We're going to find that money." Rachel didn't wait for him to finish. She lunged for the driver's side door of the SUV, which she had left unlocked. She scrambled inside, slamming the lock button just as the man's fist thudded against the glass. He shouted something muffled and angry, reaching for the door handle. Rachel threw the car into reverse, the engine roaring in the enclosed space. She didn't care about the brakes anymore. She cared about the weight of the vehicle. She swung the wheel hard, pinning the man's sedan against the concrete wall of the garage with a sickening crunch of metal. The impact jarred her teeth, but it cleared a path. She floored it, the SUV screaming out of the driveway and into the night. She drove until the suburban streets gave way to a secluded park on the edge of town, a place where teenagers went to hide from their parents. There, under the skeletal branches of a weeping willow, she opened the laptop again. Her hands were shaking too hard to type, so she forced herself to breathe, to be the woman who could organize a 500-person gala without breaking a sweat. She began to dig deeper into the final phase files, looking for the how instead of the why. She found a subdirectory labeled Silent Auction. As she scrolled through the items, donated jewelry, vacation packages, antique furniture, she noticed a pattern. The winning bids for the highest value items were all coming from the same 3 accounts, all of them linked to the shell companies Mark had created. It was a money laundering machine. He was using the gala to clean the stolen PTA funds, turning donations into legitimate, untraceable assets. But the final blow was yet to come. Rachel clicked on the authorization logs for the transfers, her heart stopping as she saw the digital signature at the bottom of every document. It wasn't Mark's. It was hers. He had stolen her credentials, her encrypted key, and used them to sign every illegal wire transfer and auction bid. On paper, she wasn't the victim of a con artist. She was the mastermind. The electronic trail was perfect, a digital cage he had spent months building around her. He hadn't just framed her for the theft. He had framed her for the entire conspiracy. If the police looked at these files tonight, they wouldn't go after Marcus Vane. They would come for Rachel Donovan, the PTA president who had systematically robbed her own children's school. The horror of it was a cold weight in her chest. She realized then that Mark had planned this betrayal with the same meticulous care he used for his scams. He had chosen her because she was perfect, because no one would ever suspect the woman with the sleek bun and the tailored blazers, until the evidence made it impossible not to. She was the perfect fall girl, the shield he would use to make his escape. She couldn't go to the police, not yet. They would see the signatures and the confessions he had undoubtedly planted, and she would be in handcuffs before she could utter a single word of the truth. She needed definitive proof of his deception, something that couldn't be forged or explained away. And she knew exactly where he would be tonight. The autumn benefit. He wouldn't miss the chance to see his masterpiece through to the end. The autumn benefit gala was a sea of silk, champagne, and deceptive smiles. Rachel stood at the entrance of the school's transformed cafeteria, her formal gown, a slate gray silk that felt like a shroud, clinging to her skin. She felt like an actress on a stage where the floor was made of glass. She greeted the wealthy donors, her voice a practiced melody of gratitude, while her eyes scanned the crowd for the man she had called her husband. Every flash of a photographer's bulb felt like an interrogation light. She could see the judgmental glares of the women she had called friends, their whispers fluttering like dry leaves in the wind. They knew something was wrong. The rumors of Mark's business troubles had already begun to circulate, and in this town, blood in the water was a social invitation. As she moved through the crowd, she noticed a group of men standing near the buffet, their suits a little too stiff, their eyes moving with a rhythmic, professional detachment. Plainclothes police. Her stomach did a slow, sickening roll. Mark had tipped them off. He wanted her caught here in front of everyone to ensure the narrative of her guilt was etched into the town's memory. She needed a weapon, something to turn the tide. She drifted toward the registration desk, her fingers brushing against a large, hollowed-out decorative centerpiece filled with autumn leaves. She remembered seeing Mark fumbling with it earlier that afternoon. She reached inside, her fingers closing around the cold, metallic edge of a burner phone. She tucked it into her clutch, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She retreated to a darkened hallway, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She powered on the phone, the screen's glow a harsh reminder of the world she was trying to dismantle. There was only one contact in the history: flight. She opened the messages and felt a surge of cold fury. Midnight. Teterboro. Hangar 7. All clear. It was the getaway plan. He was leaving in less than 2 hours. He wasn't just running from the law, he was running from the wreckage of the life he had destroyed. She looked up and saw a shadow moving at the far end of the hall, heading toward the school library. It was the gait she knew better than her own, the confident, predatory stride of Marcus Vane. She followed him, her heels clicking like a countdown on the linoleum floors. The school was a maze of shadows and half-remembered childhood innocence. She reached the library doors and slipped inside, the scent of old paper and floor wax enveloping her. Mark was standing by the central desk, his back to her, his silhouette framed by the moonlight streaming through the high windows. "It's over, Mark," she said, her voice dropping to that dangerous, compressed whisper she used when the world was falling apart. He didn't jump. He just turned slowly, a small, mocking smile playing on his lips. "Rachel, I wondered when you'd catch up. You always were the smartest person in the room. It's a shame you were so blinded by the script. I have the drive, Mark. I know about the laundering. I know about Marcus Vane." She took a step toward him, her hands clenched into fists. "Give me the files. Give me the keys to the shell accounts, or I'll scream so loud the cops at the buffet will hear me." Mark laughed, a sharp, cold sound that made her skin crawl. "Oh, Rachel, you really don't get it, do you? You're not the hero of this story. You're the character who dies in the first act to give the villain a reason to keep going." He stepped closer, his eyes devoid of any warmth. "I never loved you. You were a project. A way to build a fortress no one would ever think to look inside. And now, the fortress is burning, and I'm the only one with a key to the exit. The physical blow came without warning. He lunged forward, his hand closing around her throat, pinning her against a bookshelf. Rachel gasped, the air leaving her lungs in a pathetic wheeze. "You're going to stay here," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You're going to wait for the police to find the briefcase I left in your SUV. The one with the confession and the ticket to Brazil. You're going to be the face of the biggest scandal this town has ever seen, while I'm sipping scotch at 30,000 feet. Rage, pure and incandescent, flooded her system. She reached out, her fingers brushing against a heavy brass bookend shaped like a lion. She grabbed it and swung with everything she had, the metal connecting with Mark's jaw. He grunted and stumbled back, his grip loosening. She didn't wait. She lunged for the leather briefcase sitting on the desk, the one she had seen him carrying all night. She snatched it and bolted for the door, her heart a drumbeat of desperation. She reached the hallway and ducked into a supply closet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She fumbled with the latches of the briefcase, her fingers slick with sweat. This is it, she thought. The money, the evidence. She threw the lid open and felt the world collapse for the final time. There was no money. There were no encrypted files. Instead, there was a neatly typed letter of confession, signed with a perfect forgery of her signature, and a one-way ticket to South America in her name. He had anticipated her every move. He had led her here, to this moment, to ensure she was caught with the proof of her intent to flee. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. "Police, stay where you are." The beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness of the library, reflecting off the glass of the bookshelves. Rachel stood frozen, the briefcase clutched to her chest like a shield made of lead. Mark was standing in the doorway, his hand over his bruised jaw, his expression a masterpiece of feigned shock and betrayal. "She's in here," he shouted, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. "She has the money. Rachel, how could you?" The officers swarmed the room, their weapons drawn, the harsh light of their torches blinding her. She was at the bottom of the garbage chute, and the world was about to pull the lever. But Rachel Donovan was a woman who had spent 12 years learning how to adapt. She looked at Mark, at the triumph in his eyes, and then at the officers. She didn't drop the briefcase. Instead, she reached behind the bookshelf nearest to her, her fingers finding the small, recessed lever she had noticed during a fire safety audit months ago. "I'm not the one you want," she said, her voice suddenly clear and resonant, the voice of the PTA president who could command a room of 500. She pulled the lever. A shrill, deafening shriek filled the school. Not the standard fire alarm, but the high-security lockdown protocol. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over the library doors and windows, the mechanical boom echoing like a thunderclap. In the sudden, flashing red light of the emergency system, Rachel pulled a hidden tablet from a hollowed-out book sleeve she had prepared an hour ago. "Look at the screen, officers," she commanded. "I didn't just find the phone. I used the school's new security network, the one I personally helped fund, to live stream our little chat in the library." She turned the tablet toward them, showing the interface of a private YouTube stream with over 3,000 viewers. The entire PTA board, the district attorney's office, and half the town were watching. Mark's confession isn't just on this tablet. It's on every server in the county. The silence that followed was broken only by the rhythmic pulse of the alarm. Rachel then activated the school's internal audio system, her fingers flying over the tablet's screen. Mark's voice, cold and mocking, filled the room, repeating his admission of guilt and his plan to frame her. The lead officer, a man Rachel recognized from the school's DARE program, lowered his weapon, his expression shifting from suspicion to grim realization. Mark's face went from pale to a sickly mottled gray. He lunged for the tablet, but the other officers were faster. They tackled him to the blue carpet, the handcuffs clicking shut with a finality that made Rachel's knees finally buckle. Just as the chaos seemed to peak, Principal Eleanor Hartwell burst into the room, her silver-streaked hair disheveled, her expression a mask of panicked authority. "What is the meaning of this? Rachel, you've endangered the entire school." Rachel didn't blink. She swiped the tablet again, pulling up a series of digital logs Sarah had helped her recover. "Actually, Eleanor, let's talk about the background checks. The ones you personally suppressed for Marcus Vane 3 years ago." She showed the logs to the officers. Metadata proving that the principal's digital signature was on the documents that had allowed a convicted felon to infiltrate the school's inner circle. The principal froze, her hand flying to her bitten nails. The web of the conspiracy was finally visible, and it was larger than anyone had imagined. "The plane ticket was bought from your office computer, Eleanor," Rachel said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You weren't just protecting the school. You were his partner. You were the one who knew where the bodies were buried because you helped dig the holes." The two conspirators, the grifter and the administrator, stood side by side in the red glare of the emergency lights, their masks finally stripped away. The police didn't need any more convincing. They led them both out through the emergency exit, the crowd of gala guests parting like the Red Sea as the perfect citizens were hauled away in disgrace. Rachel walked back into the ballroom, the silence of the crowd more deafening than any alarm. She stood at the podium, her silk gown torn, her face bruised, and her signature pearls feeling like a weight she could no longer carry. She unclasped them and laid them on the mahogany surface. "I resign," she said, her voice echoing through the cafeteria. "From the PTA, from this life, and from the lie that perfection is the only armor we have." She walked out of the school, her head held high, leaving the wreckage of her reputation behind for something much more valuable: the truth. Weeks later, the morning sun poured into a small, 2-bedroom apartment in Elizabeth. The air smelled of cheap lemon cleaner and the neighbors' spicy cooking, a far cry from the sterile lavender of Oakwood Lane. Rachel sat at a small folding table, a cup of generic tea in her hand, watching her children as they hunched over their homework. The oldest looked up, her sharp hazel eyes, so like Rachel's, softening into a smile. "Mom, do you think we can go to the park later?" Rachel reached out and squeezed her hand, her fingers no longer twitching for a keyboard or a ring. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said, her voice warm and steady. The suburban mask was gone, and the house was lost. But as she looked at her children, she realized she had finally found the one thing Mark could never steal. She was still standing, and for the first time in her life, she didn't need to count to 10 to know she was safe.